In the dust-choked territories of the West, a name wasn't given. It was earned with iron, or it was burned into your skin. For one young girl, her name was Thief, seared into her flesh with a cattle brand, a mark that made her less than human, cast out and left for dead. She stumbled into the one place more unforgiving than the settlements, the high, lonely canyons of a reclusive Apache warrior. He was a man living between two worlds belonging to neither. He saw not a thief, but a survivor. And in the crucible of the Arizona sun, he would teach her a new language, the language of the revolver, and forge a weapon deadlier than any man who dared to hunt her. This is the story of how a branded girl learned to shoot straighter than any sun, and how she aimed for a justice the world had denied her. The sun was a merciless hammer, beating down on the cracked earth of the Arizona territory. For Josephine Bell, it was just another tormentor in a world that had offered nothing else. She was 17, though the hollows in her cheeks and the haunted look in her eyes made her seem a decade older. She moved not like a girl, but like a wary coyote. Her thin shoulders hunched, her gaze constantly scanning the shimmering horizon. 2 days she had been without water, and her tongue was a swollen, useless thing in her mouth. Her throat was a desert in its own right, but the thirst was a dull ache compared to the fire that lived permanently on her right shoulder blade. Even through the grimy fabric of her homespun shirt, she could feel the raised, grotesque scar tissue. The letter T, a thick, ugly brand that declared her a thief to God and all creation. The brand of Bartholomew Finch. It had happened 4 months ago, in the bustling, hypocritical town of Redemption. Josephine, an orphan, who scraped by, doing mending and laundry, had been an easy target. When a string of pearls belonging to Finch's wife Henrietta went missing, the blame fell on her as swiftly and surely as a hawk on a field mouse. It was Finch's loathsome son, Caleb, who had pointed the finger. He, with his slicked-back hair and cruel smirk, had always looked at Josephine with a possessive hunger she'd expertly ignored. Her rejection, she later realized, was her true crime. They didn't bother with a trial. Sheriff Miller, a man whose spine was made of Finch's gold, had held her down in the town square. The hiss of the hot iron against her skin was a sound that now lived in her nightmares, a serpent striking over and over. They'd whipped her, branded her, and cast her out with nothing but the clothes on her back, a declaration that she was no longer welcome among decent folk. She was property marked and discarded. Since then, survival had been a desperate, lonely scramble. She stole what she had to a half-eaten apple from a wagon, a strip of jerky left to dry on a line. The brand forced her to live up to its name. She slept in abandoned sheds and dry riverbeds, always moving, because to stay in one place meant discovery, and discovery meant a rope. Now delirium was setting in. The jagged red mesas in the distance began to swim and warp. The buzz of insects sounded like mocking whispers. She stumbled her worn-out boots, catching on a loose rock, and pitched forward. The impact with the hard-baked ground knocked the last of the air from her lungs. She lay there smelling the dust, feeling the sun cook the back of her neck. This, she thought with a strange sense of calm, was the end. The buzzards would find her before the bounty hunters. It was a small mercy. She didn't know how long she lay there before a shadow fell over her. It was a cool, blessed relief from the sun. She managed to crack an eyelid open. A figure stood over her, silhouetted against the blinding sky. He was tall and lean, with long black hair, held back by a simple leather band. His face was sharp-etched with lines that spoke of hardship and solitude. He wore buckskin trousers and a simple cotton shirt, but it was his eyes that held her. They were dark and piercing, and they missed nothing. They took in her ragged state, the desperation clinging to her like dust, and the edge of the brand visible where her shirt had torn. He was native, she could see that. Apache, by the look of him. A man more feared and hated in these parts than even an outlaw. He knelt, moving with a silent grace that seemed impossible for a man his size. He unslung a canteen from his shoulder. He didn't speak, just pulled the cork and held it to her cracked lips. The water was a miracle. It was cool and tasted of the earth. She drank greedily, spilling some down her chin. When she had taken her fill, he pulled the canteen back gently. More later, he said. His voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder. Too much now, you'll get sick. Josephine coughed the water, soothing the fire in her throat. She tried to push herself up, but her limbs were trembling and weak. He watched her struggle for a moment. His expression was unreadable, a mask of stoicism. "They hunt you," he stated. It wasn't a question. She could only nod her eyes, darting around nervously, as if the sheriff's posse might materialize from the rocks. "The Finch brand," he said, his gaze flicking to her shoulder. "He marks his cattle. Now he marks people." There was a cold contempt in his voice that surprised her. He stood up, looking back the way she had come. "Your tracks are plain. A child could follow them. They will be here by morning." Fear, sharp and cold, cut through her exhaustion. She had to run, but her body had already given up. Tears of frustration welled in her eyes. After all this, to be caught like a rabbit in a trap. The man looked down at her again. For a long moment he was silent, and Josephine was certain he would just turn and walk away, leaving her to her fate. He had no reason to help her. In this world, kindness was a currency rarer than gold and far more dangerous to spend. But then he leaned down, and with an ease that belied her dead weight, he scooped her into his arms. She was too shocked to resist. She felt the strength in his arms, the solidness of his chest. He smelled of sagebrush and leather, and something else, something wild and clean like the high desert after a rain. Where are you taking me?" she rasped. He started walking his strides, long and even, carrying her, as if she weighed no more than a sparrow. He didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on the towering rock formations ahead. "To a place they won't find you," he said, his voice quiet but absolute. "My name is Kyle, and for now, you will live." As he carried her into the labyrinth of canyons, Josephine Bell closed her eyes. She didn't know if she had been saved or simply captured by a different kind of danger. But as the sun finally began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in violent hues of orange and purple, she felt something she hadn't felt in months, the fragile, terrifying flicker of hope. She was a branded sparrow fallen from the sky, and this strange, silent man had, for reasons of his own, decided to catch her. Kyle's home was not a house, but a part of the canyon itself. Tucked into a deep alcove beneath a massive stone overhang, it was a simple one-room structure made of adobe and rock, blending so perfectly with its surroundings that a man could ride past a dozen times and never see it. A small, clear stream trickled nearby, feeding a patch of hardy vegetables. A lean-to sheltered a single sturdy-looking horse. It was a place of profound silence, broken only by the cry of a hawk overhead, or the whisper of the wind through the sage. For 3 days, Josephine did little more than sleep and drink the thin, savory broth Kyle prepared for her. He was a man of few words, but his actions were deliberate and efficient. He cleaned the grime from her face with a damp cloth, tended to the cuts on her feet, and replaced her tattered boots with a pair of soft moccasins. He never mentioned the brand again, yet she felt his eyes on it, whenever her back was turned, a silent acknowledgement of the ugliness she carried. On the 4th day, her strength began to return. She sat up on the cot he had given her, and watched him as he worked, mending a bridle with nimble, practiced fingers. The silence between them was no longer just an absence of noise. It was a living thing, heavy with unspoken questions. Why, she finally asked, her voice still rough. Kyle didn't look up from his work. Why what? Why did you help me? You don't know me. He paused, pulling the waxed thread taut. He looked at her then, and his dark eyes seemed to see right through her defenses to the scared and angry girl hiding beneath. I know the brand. And I know Bartholomew Finch. That is enough to know. He's a powerful man, Josephine warned, a bitter taste in her mouth. He owns the law in redemption. He'll send men. Let them come, Kyle said, his voice flat. The desert has a way of swallowing foolish men. He returned to his mending the conversation seemingly over. But Josephine was persistent. She had been a victim for too long. What are you, a bounty hunter? An outlaw? A faint, mirthless smile touched his lips. I am a man who wishes to be left alone. My people were Chiricahua. The army moved them to the reservation at San Carlos. I did not go. He said it so simply, but Josephine understood the weight of his words. San Carlos was a death camp, a place of disease and starvation. This man was a ghost, a remnant of a people scattered to the winds. He was as much an outcast as she was. The next morning, Kyle woke her before dawn. He handed her a piece of jerky and a full canteen. Come was all he said. He led her out of the alcove and up a winding, treacherous path that climbed the side of the canyon. The air grew thinner, cooler. By the time the sun's first rays touched the canyon rim, they were standing on a high, flat mesa. A few gnarled juniper trees clung to the rock, and a scattering of targets, tin cans, bleached animal skulls, and small wooden discs were set up at varying distances. Kyle unstrapped a long cloth bundle he had been carrying. He unwrapped it to reveal a pistol. It was a Colt Peacemaker, its metal worn smooth in places, its wooden grip dark with age and use. It was a beautiful, terrible thing. He held it out to her. You know how to use one of these. Josephine shook her head, staring at the weapon as if it were a coiled snake. You will learn, he said. He showed her how to hold it, his large, warm hand covering hers for a moment, to correct her grip. He demonstrated the proper stance, feet apart, balanced, relaxed. His movements were fluid, economical. The gun is not a club. It is a tool. It has no will but the one you give it. He placed a single cartridge in the cylinder, snapped it shut, and handed the gun to her. It was heavier than she expected, a solid, menacing weight in her hand. Aim for the largest can, he instructed, pointing to a tin set on a rock 20 paces away. Do not think of the target. Think of the front sight. Put it where you want the bullet to go. Breathe out. Squeeze the trigger. Do not pull it. Josephine's heart hammered against her ribs. She raised the Colt, her arms trembling under its weight. The front sight wavered, dancing around the can. She took a ragged breath, closed her eyes for a second, and squeezed. The explosion was deafening. The recoil slammed her wrist back, and the gun nearly flew from her grasp. Acrid smoke filled the air. The can remained untouched. A puff of dust kicked up a good 2 feet to its left. She stared, mortified. A hot flush of shame crept up her neck. Kyle showed no reaction. Again he said calmly. He reloaded the single round and handed it back. Again she fired, and again she missed, this time high. Again. The bullet struck the rock below the can, sending chips flying. Over and over under the patient, unblinking gaze of her teacher, she fired and she missed. Frustration gnawed at her. Her arms ached. The constant roar of the gun made her ears ring. I can't do it! She finally cried out, throwing the gun to the ground in a fit of rage. Tears streamed down her dusty cheeks. "I'm useless." Kyle walked over and picked up the Colt, carefully checking it for dirt. He looked at her, his expression not angry, but serious. "The rage you feel now, the shame, this is what Finch and his son gave you. It is a poison. You can let it eat you from the inside, or you can put it to use. It can be the fire that forges the iron." He gestured to the pistol. "This iron has no anger. It has no fear. It does what it is told. Your mind must be the same when you hold it. Your hands must be steady. Your eye must be clear. The fire goes inside you, not into your arms. It is the fuel, it is not the flame." His words struck a chord deep within her. He was right. Her anger was a wild, useless thing, a fire that only burned herself. He was offering her a way to shape it, to aim it. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and stood up straight. "Let me try again." This time something was different. She held the gun and felt its weight not as a burden, but as an extension of her will. She remembered Kyle's words. The fire goes inside. She drew a slow breath, letting it out, as she brought the front sight to bear on the can. She imagined Caleb Finch's smug face, Sheriff Miller's indifferent cruelty, the jeering crowd in the town square. She channeled all the bitterness, all the injustice into a single cold point of focus. She squeezed the trigger. The gun bucked, but this time she was ready for it. And across the mesa, the tin can jumped into the air with a satisfying ping, landing in the dust, with a small hole punched cleanly through its center. A slow, fierce smile spread across Josephine's face. It was the first time she had truly smiled in months. Kyle nodded once, a flicker of approval in his dark eyes. "Good," he said. "Now the smaller one." The canyon became her forge, and Kyle the mastersmith. Every day they were on the mesa. He taught her to load fire and clean the Colt until she could do it blindfolded. He taught her to shoot from a crouch from her hip, and even with her left hand. He made her run up the canyon trail until her lungs burned, and then made her fire, teaching her to control her breathing and steady her aim under duress. He taught her more than shooting. He taught her the ways of the desert. She learned to read tracks in the dirt, to find water, to move without a sound. She learned which plants were medicine and which were poison. Her body, once frail and starved, grew hard and lean. The sun browned her skin, and the canyon winds whipped strength into her. The haunted look in her eyes was slowly replaced by a glint of hardened steel. The brand on her back still burned with memory, but it no longer felt like the end of her story. Kyle had given her a new tool, a new purpose. The brand was the question of her past. The Colt in her hand was becoming the answer for her future. 2 months passed in the crucible of Crow's Beak Canyon. Josephine's world had shrunk to the rock walls, the whispering stream, and the ever-present weight of the peacemaker on her hip. She was no longer the scrawny, terrified girl who had collapsed in the desert. Her hands were calloused. Her gaze was steady, and she could hit a silver dollar tossed in the air from 30 paces. Kyle's teaching had been relentless, but it had reforged her. One sweltering afternoon, Kyle announced he was going for supplies. It was a journey he made every few months to a remote fly-speck trading post called Dust Devil Gulch, a place that catered to prospectors, trappers, and men who preferred not to answer too many questions. "You will stay here," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Keep out of sight. Keep the rifle close." Josephine felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. His departures, though necessary, always left the canyon feeling vast and empty, the silence suddenly menacing. "Be careful, Cale." He simply nodded, saddled his horse, and rode out, disappearing into the shimmering heat haze without a backward glance. Left to her own devices, Josephine practiced. She ran through the drills Kyle had taught her, her movements becoming a seamless, deadly dance. Draw aim, fire, reload, repeat. The rhythmic certainty of it calmed her nerves. But as the sun began its descent, casting long, distorted shadows across the canyon floor, a profound loneliness set in. She found herself staring east in the direction of the world that had cast her out, a world she both loathed and, to her own surprise, sometimes missed. Meanwhile, Cale rode into Dust Devil Gulch. It wasn't much of a town, just a single dusty street with a general store, a blacksmith and a saloon, whose warped sign promised warm beer and bad company. The proprietor of the general store was a man named Peterson, a wiry old-timer with rheumy eyes who valued discretion above all else. He and Kyle had a long-standing, unspoken agreement. Kyle traded well-tanned pelts for flour salt coffee and ammunition, and Peterson never asked where he came from or where he was going. As Peterson measured out coffee beans, two men sauntered in their spurs, jingling on the wooden floorboards. They were Finch's men, their belts stamped with the familiar F cattle brand. One was a burly bearded man named Gus. The other was a younger twitchy fellow called Donnie. Peterson. Gus grunted his eyes, scanning the store's meager shelves. Seen any strangers passing through, particularly a skinny girl with a pretty face and a mark on her shoulder. Peterson, without looking up, continued to scoop beans. Folks pass through. I don't take their inventory. Donnie sidled closer to the counter, his eyes falling on Cale, who stood silently in the corner, examining a set of new knives. What about him? Ain't seen him around before. Kyle didn't move, but Peterson could feel the temperature in the room drop. The old storekeeper had seen Kyle only a handful of times over the years, but he recognized the lethal stillness of a man who was dangerous, not because he was loud, but because he was quiet. He's a trapper, Peterson said quickly. Trades with me now and again. Minds his own business. Gus swaggered over to Cale, looking him up and down with open contempt. A trapper, huh? You an Apache? Kyle slowly raised his head, his dark eyes meeting Gus's. He said nothing. Cat got your tongue, Chief Gus taunted, spitting a stream of tobacco juice that landed dangerously close to Cale's boots. Mr. Finch is paying $100 for that thieving girl. You see her, you best let us know. Easier money than skinning beavers. Kyle's gaze was like chips of obsidian. I have seen nothing, he said. His voice low and even. Gus seemed to be looking for a fight, but something in Kyle's unwavering stare gave him pause. It was the look of a man who had seen real violence, not the blustering kind practiced in saloons. The big man grunted, seeming to think better of it. Just keep your eyes open, Injun. He and Donnie bought a bottle of whiskey and left their laughter echoing down the street as they headed for the saloon. Cale finished his transaction with Peterson in silence. As he packed his supplies onto his horse, he saw a new poster nailed to the saloon wall. It was a wanted poster, but not from any official lawman. It was privately issued, bearing the authority of the Finch Ranch. The sketch was crude, but recognizable as Josephine. Beneath it, the words were stark: $100 reward for the apprehension, dead or alive, of the thief Josephine Bell, marked with a T brand on the shoulder, considered armed and dangerous. A new name had arrived in Dust Devil Gulch that day, not on a stagecoach, but on the back of a weary horse. U.S. Marshal Franklin Reed dismounted in front of the saloon, a tall, severe-looking man in his late 40s. His face was weathered, and his eyes, the color of a stormy sky, seemed to take in everything at once. He was a man defined by the letter of the law, a force of order, in a land that perpetually resisted it. He had been sent from Prescott at the request of Bartholomew Finch, who had petitioned the territorial governor about the rising tide of lawlessness in his district. Finch had conveniently framed his request around cattle rustling and vagrancy, never mentioning his personal vendetta against a single branded girl. Reed entered the saloon, his presence immediately silencing the low chatter. He ordered a water and scanned the room. His eyes fell on Gus and Donnie, noting the Finch brand on their holsters. "I'm Marshal Reed," he announced to the room. "I'm looking for information regarding criminal activity in this region, specifically rustling syndicates." Gus, emboldened by whiskey, laughed. "Ain't no syndicates here, Marshal. Just a little thief girl Mr. Finch once found. There's a poster right outside." Reed's eyes narrowed slightly. He had read the poster. Private bounties were a legal grey area he despised, often leading to more bloodshed than justice. "I am not a bounty hunter, son. I hunt criminals, not lost livestock." Bartholomew Finch's personal grievances are his own. He finished his water and turned to leave, but paused at the door. However, he said, his voice carrying a new edge of authority, "If this girl is armed and dangerous, as the poster claims, and if she commits a crime in my jurisdiction, she becomes my business. The same goes for any man who thinks a private bounty gives him license to act outside the law." He stepped outside his gaze, sweeping across the desolate landscape. He saw a lone rider in the distance, heading towards the jagged canyons in the west. The rider was too far away to identify, but Reed filed the image away. He was a meticulous man. The canyons, he knew, were a place where the law of men rarely reached. They were a place where fugitives and secrets could hide. He had a feeling his business and Bartholomew Finch's were destined to intersect whether he liked it or not. When Kyle returned to the canyon late the next day, his mood was darker than Josephine had ever seen it. He told her about the poster about Finch's men, about the $100 price on her head. The news landed like a physical blow. $100. Her life was worth the price of a good horse. The words, "dead or alive," echoed in her head. "They'll never stop looking," she whispered, her hands clenched into fists. No, Kyle agreed. They will not. This is no longer about a string of pearls. It is about Finch's pride. "You are a loose end," he once tied. He paused, his gaze intense. "And now there is a marshal in the territory. A real one. He will be harder to avoid than Finch's hired thugs." Fear, cold and familiar, tried to coil around Josephine's heart. But then she felt the cold, hard steel of the Colt pressing against her thigh. She looked at Kyle, at the unyielding strength in his face. The forge in the canyon had tempered her. She was not the same girl. "Let them come," she said, her voice quiet but clear, echoing the very words Kyle had spoken weeks before. Let them all come. The arrival of Marshal Reed and the news of the bounty changed the rhythm of their lives in the canyon. The illusion of safety was gone, replaced by a constant humming tension. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like approaching hoofbeats. Kyle became even more vigilant, often disappearing for hours to scout the surrounding ridges, his face a mask of grim concentration upon his return. Their training sessions on the mesa took on a new urgency. It was no longer about learning. It was about perfection. Faster Kyle would command, his voice sharp as flint. "They will not give you time to think. Your body must know what to do before your mind does." He would throw rocks into the air without warning. "Draw," he'd shout, and Josephine would have to spin, draw, and fire, shattering the rock before it hit the ground. He made her shoot at targets, while on the move, stumbling over the uneven terrain, teaching her that a real fight was never on a flat, stable range. One day, he led her to a narrow section of the canyon where the walls were only 20 feet apart. He placed a single small wooden disc on a ledge on the opposite wall. "Hit it," he said. Josephine took her stance, aimed carefully, and fired. The bullet struck the rock face inches from the target. She tried again with the same result. The target was small, the distance deceptive. "You are thinking of the gun," Kyle said, standing behind her. "You feel its weight. You are conscious of the trigger. You must forget it. The Colt is your hand. The bullet is your finger reaching out to touch what you see." He placed a hand on her shoulder. "Close your eyes." She obeyed. "Picture the disc. See its color, the grain of the wood. Now open your eyes and fire. Do not aim. Just look. Point and touch." It sounded like madness, but she trusted him. She closed her eyes, visualizing the target with perfect clarity. When she opened them, her eyes locked onto the disc. In one fluid motion, almost before she was aware of it, her hand came up, the gun roared, and the wooden disc splintered into pieces. She stared stunned at her own hand. It felt as if someone else had fired the gun. "That is how it must be." Kyle said a rare note of approval in his voice. Instinct. The eye and the hand as one. In the quiet evenings as they sat by the small fire, the conversation sometimes turned from survival to the past. Josephine, emboldened by their shared purpose, began to ask Kyle about his own life. "You said your people were taken to San Carlos," she said one night, tracing patterns in the dirt with a stick. "Why didn't you go with them?" Kyle was silent for a long time, staring into the flames. The firelight played across the harsh angles of his face, making the old grief carved there seem fresh. "I had a wife," he said finally, his voice so low she had to lean in to hear. "Her name was Nita. And a son, just a boy. When the soldiers came to our village, there was a misunderstanding. A young lieutenant, arrogant and scared, thought my son was reaching for a weapon. He was only reaching for his mother." The story hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Josephine felt a cold dread creep over her. The lieutenant fired. Kyle continued, his voice devoid of all emotion. "Nita threw herself in front of our boy. The bullet took them both. In the chaos that followed, I did what I had to do. I could not go to a reservation and live on the government's charity after that. Their world holds nothing for me. This canyon, this is all I have left. Solitude is its own kind of peace." Josephine finally understood the source of his stillness, the profound sorrow that lay beneath his hardened exterior. He hadn't just lost his family. He had seen them stolen from him by the same kind of blind injustice that had branded her. He saw a reflection of his own pain in her. "I'm sorry, Cale," she whispered the words, feeling utterly inadequate. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw not a mentor or a protector, but a man drowning in a grief so deep it had no bottom. "We all carry brands, Josephine. Yours is on your skin. Mine is on my soul. The only difference is the world can see yours." Their bond deepened after that night. They were no longer just a teacher and a student, but two wounded souls who had found a strange, unspoken solace in each other's company. He was the anchor that kept her from being swept away by her rage, and she, with her fierce determination to live, was a flicker of light in his long darkness. The first test of her new skills came unexpectedly. She was down by the stream, refilling their canteens, when she heard a dry, rattling buzz from the rocks above. Her blood ran cold. She looked up to see a large, diamond-back rattlesnake coiled on a ledge directly above the path Kyle would take on his way back from a scouting trip. It was poised to strike its head, swaying its tail a blur. There was no time to shout a warning. Kyle was still out of sight around a bend. Panic seized her for a heartbeat, threatening to paralyze her. Then his training took over. Do not think. The eye and the hand as one. Her hand moved in a blur. The Colt was out of its holster, cocked and fired in a single fluid motion. The shot echoed through the canyon like a crack of thunder. The snake's head disintegrated in a bloody spray, its body whipping violently before falling limp from the ledge. Kyle came running around the bend, rifle in hand, his face a storm cloud. He saw her standing with the smoking pistol in her hand, and then the dead snake on the path. He looked from the snake to her, his eyes wide, with a mixture of shock and dawning respect. He walked over and nudged the snake with his boot. The shot was perfect, a killing blow. He looked back at her, at this girl he had found, half dead in the desert. She stood tall, the Colt held loosely at her side, as if it were a part of her. The fear was gone from her eyes, replaced by a cold, hard calm. He said nothing, but he didn't have to. In that moment, Josephine Bell knew she was no longer a victim. She was no longer just a girl with a brand. She was a survivor. She was a gunslinger. The weight of the Colt in her hand was no longer a burden. It was a promise that she would be the one to decide her own fate. The late summer heat settled over the territory, baking the life out of the landscape. Supplies were running low again, and Cale prepared for another trip to Dust Devil Gulch, this time with more trepidation. The poster would still be up, and Marshal Reed's presence made the region a tinderbox, waiting for a spark. "This time I'm going with you," Josephine announced, holstering her Colt. Kyle turned from his horse, his expression stern. "No, it is too dangerous. They are looking for you. They're looking for a scared, branded girl." She countered, her chin set stubbornly. "That's not who I am anymore. I can't hide in this canyon forever, Kyle. And you need someone to watch your back." She cut her long brown hair short and, ragged with a knife, bundled it under a dusty, wide-brimmed hat and pulled on a worn men's coat. The change was startling. With the hat pulled low, she could pass for a slender youth. He studied her for a long moment, seeing the iron resolve in her eyes. She was right. Hiding was not living. "Stay close," he said finally. "No talking. Let me handle everything." The ride to Dust Devil Gulch was nerve-wracking. Every rider they saw in the distance made Josephine's hand drift to the butt of her pistol. But they arrived without incident. As they entered the town, she kept her head down, her hat shadowing her face. She saw the wanted poster nailed to the wall, her own crude likeness staring back at her. A cold fury settled in her gut. While Kyle went into the general store, Josephine waited outside, pretending to be occupied with tightening the cinch on her saddle. That's when she heard the voice that haunted her nightmares, a lazy, arrogant drawl dripping with cruelty. "Well, look what we have here." A couple of stray dogs sniffing around for scraps. Josephine froze. Standing not 30 feet away, swaggering out of the saloon, were Caleb Finch and his two cronies, the same men who had held her down for the branding. Caleb looked just as she remembered his expensive clothes, coated in a layer of dust. A silver-plated revolver hanging low on his hip, his face flushed with whiskey and self-importance. Her heart pounded in her chest, a wild drumbeat of hatred and fear. The world seemed to narrow until it was just her and him. Her hand instinctively went to her Colt. All the training, all the hours on the mesa, it all came rushing to the forefront of her mind. The fire goes inside, the eye and the hand as one. She could draw and fire before he even cleared leather. She could end it right here, right now. The justice the world had denied her was sitting in her holster. Caleb's gaze swept over her dismissively, registering only a scruffy boy. He and his men were focused on Cale, who was just emerging from Peterson's store, his arms laden with supplies. "If it ain't the quiet trapper," Caleb sneered, blocking Cale's path. "My boys told me about you. The Apache who plays dumb. Maybe you've seen something since the last time they asked." A certain girl, perhaps Cale's face was stone. I have nothing for you. That's the wrong answer, Caleb said, stepping closer. He was trying to provoke a reaction, to show off for his men and the few dusty onlookers. My father owns this territory, and everything in it. That includes you. Maybe we ought to teach you some manners. Josephine's vision went red. Her thumb found the hammer of her Colt. She could feel the cool metal, could almost feel the recoil before it even happened. This was it. This was the moment. But just as her muscles tensed to draw Kyle's voice, cut through her rage, low and sharp. Josephine. No. He hadn't even looked at her, but he knew. He could feel her intent from across the street. His command was an anchor in the storm of her hatred, pulling her back from the brink. To draw now would mean a bloodbath. It would bring the whole world down on them, including Marshal Reed. It would be revenge, but it would also be suicide. Kyle slowly placed his supplies on the ground, his movements calm and deliberate. He faced Caleb, his body relaxed but paused like a wolf waiting for a dog to finish barking. Your father owns land, Kyle said, his voice quiet but carrying an immense weight. He does not own the sun in the sky, the air we breathe, or the men who walk on the earth. You would do well to remember that. Caleb, unaccustomed to being spoken to with anything but fear or deference, was taken aback. His hand dropped to his own pistol. Are you threatening me? Before the situation could escalate further, the door to the marshal's temporary office, a converted storage room, swung open. Marshal Franklin Reed stepped out onto the boardwalk, his grey eyes taking in the scene instantly. Is there a problem here? Mr. Finch Reed asked, his voice calm but layered with unmistakable authority. Caleb immediately straightened up his bravado, deflating slightly in the presence of federal law. No problem, Marshal. Just having a conversation with this local. Your conversation looked a little one-sided. Reed observed his gaze shifting from Caleb to Cale, and then lingering for a moment on the slender boy standing by the horses. This is a public street, not your father's personal corral. I suggest you and your men move along. Caleb flushed with anger and embarrassment, but he wasn't foolish enough to defy a U.S. Marshal. He shot Cale a look filled with venom. This isn't over, Trapper. He and his men mounted their horses and galloped out of town, kicking up a cloud of dust. Reed watched them go, then turned his attention back to Cale. You'd be wise to stay clear of that one. He's got all of his father's arrogance, and none of his sense. His eyes flicked to Josephine again, a flicker of something curiosity-suspicion in their depths. You and your boy should be on your way. Kyle nodded once to the marshal, gathered his things, and mounted. Josephine, her heart still racing, swung into her saddle, keeping her hat pulled low. They rode out of Dust Devil Gulch in silence, the tension between them thick enough to taste. They were miles out of town before Kyle finally spoke. You almost did something very foolish. He deserved it, Josephine shot back, her voice trembling with suppressed fury. He was right there, after everything he did, everything he took from me. And what would have happened next? Kyle asked, his voice hard. You would be dead or in chains. I would be dead. And Caleb Finch would be a martyr. Revenge is a fire that consumes the person who holds it, Josephine. It burns away everything you are until only the hate is left. So I'm supposed to do nothing, she cried. Just let him walk the earth free and clear. No, Kyle said, pulling his horse to a stop and turning to face her. You do not do nothing. You live. You survive. You become stronger than them. Stronger than their money, their power, their brands. True justice is not about a quick bullet in a dusty street. It is about taking back the life they tried to steal from you. Do not let that boy's shadow dictate your future." His words, born of his own profound loss, silenced her. He was right. Killing Caleb would have been an end, but it would have been Finch's ending, not hers. It would have proved them right that she was nothing but a violent, dangerous animal. She looked back at the trail, at the dust still hanging in the air from Caleb's departure. The shadow of her past had found her, but she had not pulled the trigger. Kyle had given her the skill to kill, but he was also teaching her the wisdom of when not to. The weight of the Colt on her hip felt different now. It was not just a tool for vengeance, but a tool for defense, for protecting the new life she was building, one difficult, dusty day at a time. Caleb Finch was not a man to let a public slight go unanswered. Humiliated, he rode back to the ranch and fed his father a twisted story of an insolent Apache hiding the branded thief painting, Marshall Reed, as an interfering bureaucrat. Bartholomew Finch, a man whose power tolerated no defiance, would not let the challenge stand. He confronted Marshall Reed, declaring his intent to form a posse. Reed, sensing a lynching in the making, reluctantly agreed to accompany them. "This will be done by the book," the marshal warned. "The girl is to be brought back alive for trial." Kyle, ever watchful, saw the distant dust cloud from a high ridge. He raced back to the alcove. "They are coming," he said, his voice grim. "A dozen riders at least. The marshal is with them." Fear pricked Josephine, but it was quickly replaced by cold resolve. This was the fight she had been training for. "We can't outrun them," Kyle stated, grabbing his rifle. "This is our ground. We will make our stand at the Narrows." The Narrows was a natural choke point in the canyon, a perfect place for an ambush. They scrambled up the rocks, concealing themselves on opposite sides of the trail, commanding the passage below. Hours later, the posse rode into the trap. Caleb was at the front, his face a mask of eager cruelty, with Marshall Reed beside him, his eyes scanning the rocks above. As they entered the narrowest point, Kyle gave the signal. Their rifles cracked in unison. The shots were not aimed at the men, but at the rock face, just above them, sending a shower of stone chips raining down. The posse erupted into chaos. Horses reared and screamed, throwing two riders. Wild, unaimed shots echoed uselessly off the canyon walls. "They're up there!" someone shouted. Josephine worked the lever of her rifle, firing methodically. She kicked up dust in front of Caleb's horse, forcing it back. She was not trying to kill, but to control, to make them believe they were facing a much larger force. "We have to flush them out," Caleb shrieked. "Gustoni, take 3 men and climb the south ridge. Get above them." Kyle saw the group break away. "Keep them pinned down," he called to Josephine. "I will handle the others." He melted back into the shadows, moving with the silent grace of a predator. He intercepted the flanking party as they struggled up the steep incline, disabling them with brutal, non-lethal efficiency. He took no lives, but he ended their fight. Below, Marshall Reed watched the battle with growing suspicion. The shooters in the rocks were disciplined, their fire controlled. This wasn't the work of a panicked thief. Seeing Caleb cowering behind his horse, Reed decided to find the truth for himself. He began to climb the ridge toward Cale's position, his pistol drawn. Just then, Caleb spotted a muzzle flash from Josephine's hiding place. "I've got you now, you witch!" He shrieked and fired. The bullet slammed into the rock near her head, and a sharp shard flew off, striking her arm. She cried out in pain, dropping her rifle. Her cry was the fatal distraction. For a split second, Cale's attention snapped away from the approaching marshal. It was all the opening Reed needed. He lunged, tackling Cale and sending them both tumbling behind the cover of rocks. Seeing Josephine was hit, Caleb broke cover, a triumphant, savage grin on his face. "It's over." He started scrambling up the rocks toward her, his pistol ready for the killing shot. Josephine clutched her bleeding arm, the pain sharp and sickening. Her rifle was out of reach. Panic surged, but then her fingers brushed the worn grip of her Colt. The fire goes inside. Gritting her teeth, she drew the peacemaker, propping her injured arm on a rock to steady her aim. Caleb was halfway up, raising his pistol. Time seemed to slow. Josephine saw not a man, but a target. She breathed out and squeezed the trigger. The Colt bucked. A single dark hole appeared in Caleb Finch's right shoulder. He screamed a high, thin sound as his silver-plated revolver flew from his nerveless grasp, clattering down the rocks. The decisive shot echoed, and then there was silence. Up above, Marshal Reed had Kyle pinned, but saw the entire scene unfold. He saw the weeping coward on the ground, and the wounded but resolute girl who had fired not to kill, but to disarm. In that moment, he understood the whole lie. "Drop your weapons!" Reed bellowed to the stunned men below his voice, booming with federal authority. "This posse is disbanded. This is now a federal matter." Marshal Reed was a man of the law, but he was not a fool. Back in Dust Devil Gulch, the truth unspooled with swift certainty. Under Reed's relentless questioning, Caleb's lies crumbled, and one of the ranch hands confessed the entire setup. When Bartholomew Finch arrived with threats, he found his power meant nothing against the unbendable will of federal justice. The Finch empire had finally hit a wall it could not break. Reed did not arrest Josephine or Cale. He took their statements, and in an act of true justice advised them to disappear. "The law will deal with the Finches," he said gruffly, "but it will be a slow, messy business. Find a place where their money can't be heard." They rode back to the sanctuary of Crow's Beak Canyon, the quiet now a blanket of peace, not isolation. The purpose of their training was fulfilled, leaving a question of what came next. One evening, Kyle looked out at the vast, star-dusted sky. "Your life is your own now, Josephine," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard. "You have earned your freedom. You can go anywhere." The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. She looked at the quiet man who had not just taught her to shoot, but had taught her to be whole. She realized leaving would mean abandoning the only home she had ever known. "The world is a big place," she said, a determined smile on her face. "I don't think I want to see it alone." A slow understanding dawned on his face. She was no longer his student, but his partner. They were a family, forged not by blood but by gunpowder, and a stubborn refusal to be broken. The brand on her back would always be a scar, a map of where she had been, but it no longer defined her. It was simply a reminder of the battle she had won. The story of Josephine Bell and Cale is a testament to the fact that justice in the Old West was rarely found in a courtroom. It was forged in the heat of the desert, earned by those with the will to survive against impossible odds. Theirs is a story of how the deepest wounds can give birth to the greatest strengths, and how family can be found in the most unlikely of places. It reminds us that our identity is not defined by the brands others try to place upon us, but by the choices we make when we're pushed to the edge. What did you think of Josephine's journey from a branded outcast to a formidable gunslinger? If this story of resilience and redemption resonated with you, and if you want to hear more tales from the forgotten corners of the American West, please show your support. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who loves a powerful story, and be sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Your support allows us to keep these legends alive. Thanks for listening.